You can hear just how cunningly Palestrina got his own way in the final climax of the Creed. It's pretty obvious what the words are, Amen, so he allowed himself to let rip, overlapping Amen after Amen in a beautiful cascade of sound. A masterpiece like the Pope Marcellus Mass may have solved the immediate crisis in Catholic church music, but there was a much deeper one looming. Music was at a crossroads.
The fact is, the church's grip on music was gradually eroding during this period anyway. Up until the Renaissance, it had been without doubt the most important sponsor of art and music. In 1500, virtually all professional composers were employed by the church. But gradually, wealthy aristocratic families started to get in on the act. And by 1600, you were most likely to be employed by one of them. And unlike the church, these patrons were interested in music that was purely for entertainment.
With more and more rich merchants and ambitious bigwigs in the driving seat, what followed was an explosion of music that was purely for pleasure. These new patrons commissioned composers to write music they could show off to their guests. And just as they did with painters, architects and landscape gardeners, they competed with each other to hire the best talent around. A new era of European music began with this musical partnership in the 16th century, in which Palestrina himself played a role.
Even though he was the most senior musician in Christendom, Palestrina wasn't above writing secular music himself. In the summer of 1564, he was able to combine both by accepting a post here at the Villa d'Este in Tivoli, outside Rome, where he was a kind of composer in residence.
The villa had been built in the high Renaissance style by a wealthy aristocrat cardinal, Ippolito d'Este. Not only was he an important churchman, he was also a major league art lover. And so, as well as being in charge of the cardinal's holy music, Palestrina was also expected to lay on the after-dinner entertainment at the banquets that the fun-loving Ippolito liked to throw.
Palestrina wasn't alone in this dual approach to music. All the composers of the time had a foot in both camps and wrote secular as well as sacred music. And it wasn't just performed by professional musicians either.
The 1500s saw an explosion in the number of people participating in music making. In particular, there was an enormous demand for collections of love songs that amateur singers could sing together. The Renaissance equivalent of the hit single was the madrigal, a love song for 4 voices. More and more of this type of music was now being printed. To make these songbooks user-friendly, it became the practice to print the syllables of the text precisely underneath the notes they were supposed to be sung to. And since many of the lyrics were taken from famous poems, composers began to use the greatest care to make the music fit the rhythms and stresses of the poet's words. By emphasizing the need to hear the words clearly, composers were doing exactly the same in secular music as the Council of Trent was asking them to do in sacred music. So if Palestrina was looking for a model for his new, simpler style, he didn't have to look far, since it was all around him in the shape of the ubiquitous madrigal. The most influential of these songwriters was music's equivalent of Michelangelo, and he too was known by his first name alone, Josquin. His biggest hit was a love song for four voices, possibly written for, though presumably not about, the Emperor Charles V, called 1,000 Regrets. Madrigals could be sung unaccompanied, but in the 16th century the idea that a nicely brought up young man or woman should be able to play a musical instrument as well as be able to sing began to take off. Many talented toffs began to commission music they could play themselves, and the demand for all types of music expanded rapidly throughout the 16th century. This explosion of musical markets enabled composers to seize the initiative. If one patron or organisation didn't like what you were up to, you could go in search of another. If the church was being too restrictive, there were wealthy merchants with different ideas. And if the taste in one region didn't suit you, you could try your luck elsewhere. And composers seizing the initiative nearly always means one thing: the emergence of new instruments. 1564 saw the arrival of a stunning new piece of gear in music's shop window. The violin was to become one of the most influential agents of change in music's history. The emergence of the violin was to be the main catalyst for the rise and rise of instrumental music, which really began to take off in the 1500s. At the beginning of the century, there was a confusing variety of instruments around. Apart from horns and drums and bagpipes of various types, there was also a multitude of stringed instruments, and it was from their ranks that the modern orchestra would evolve. Several of these stringed instruments can be seen in a wonderful fresco by the artist Ferrari in the church of Il Santuario di Saronno near Milan. The frieze is called the Concert of the Angels, and it was painted in 1535. A whole panoply of weird and wonderful instruments is depicted, including some the artist evidently just made up. Amongst the real instruments shown is the vihuela, which the Spanish adapted from the Moorish lute, a kind of many-stringed guitar. There was also the viola da gamba, which you played between your knees with a bow. Then there were folky, fiddly instruments like the Middle Eastern rebec, a version of which the French called the pocket and the English the kit, medieval fiddles that had 2 or 3 melody strings and a tiny body. There was even a high-tech version of the fiddle called the hurdy-gurdy or organistrum. This had a wheel you turned at the bottom for a sort of one-note drone accompaniment for the tune, which you picked out with the other hand. Hurdy-gurdies still exist in folk music. There was also the lira da braccio or arm fiddle, which liked to think itself descended from the ancient Greeks, Orpheus in the underworld and all that.